James Scott and his friend Tim had always been drawn to adventure, but this time their thirst for exploration would lead them into a nightmare beyond their worst fears. They were on the brink of a journey that would test their bodies, minds, and will to survive. They had already done a few Himalayan treks and felt confident when they decided to take a shortcut off the mapped route. The mountains were mesmerizing, snow-capped, and the crisp mountain air filled their lungs. Everything seemed perfect, but the mountains are never forgiving. Tim's legs started throbbing. At first, he brushed it off, assuming it was just a bit of fatigue from the climb, but the pain intensified, becoming more agonizing with each step. When they reached a fork in the path, Tim knew he couldn't go any further. "You go ahead, James. I'll head back," Tim said, his face contorted in pain. James hesitated. Something in his gut told him not to let him go alone, but the thought of turning back after coming so far gnawed at him. "Do you promise we'll meet for dinner in Kathmandu on Christmas Eve?" Tim asked, trying to lighten the mood. James chuckled, unaware that this would be their last conversation. As James continued, the clear sky suddenly turned gray. A storm was rapidly approaching. Snowflakes the size of golf balls began to fall, and within minutes, the entire landscape was shrouded in white. Visibility dropped to near zero. His trail had disappeared. Panic surged through him. He reached into his bag for the map. That's when he realized his fatal mistake. He had given Tim their only lighter. No fire, no warmth, no way to survive the night. James pressed on, his heart pounding harder with each step. The storm intensified, the wind howling like an unseen force, pushing him back. Snow clung to his face, freezing his eyelashes. His breath came in ragged gasps. Every step he took felt heavier. The realization that he was utterly alone in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth began to sink in. James pushed forward, trying to convince himself he could make it through the night. He'd always been a strong hiker, an athlete even. But now his body felt small and powerless against the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Himalayas. He stumbled over a hidden rock beneath the snow, falling down a small embankment, the impact driving a sharp pain into his ribs. As he lay there, staring up at the gray, swirling sky. "Get up," he told himself. "You can't stop." As he stood, something else caught his attention. A distant growl. James froze. Was it the wind? Or something else? His eyes darted across the landscape, searching for movement, but the storm obscured everything beyond a few feet. His pulse quickened. He was no longer sure if he was simply lost, or if something out there was watching him. James knew he needed to find shelter quickly. His body was already shivering uncontrollably, a clear warning sign of hypothermia setting in. He stumbled towards a small formation of jagged rocks jutting out of the snow. Reaching them, he huddled behind one, shielding himself from the worst of the wind. It wasn't much, but it was something. He reached into his backpack, hoping to find some food, but his stomach clenched. He had planned for a simple hike, assuming he would be back to a warm meal in a couple of days. His supplies were minimal. A few extra clothes, a couple of books, a small first aid kit. Nothing that could sustain him. His hands trembled as he zipped the bag shut. He needed to think. Fast. Minutes turned into hours. The storm raged on relentlessly. James curled up, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He thought about Tim, about their last words. Had he made the right decision? Should he have turned back? Regret was a dangerous thing. It could break a man faster than hunger or cold. He tried to distract himself, focusing on his breathing, in, out, Keep moving, keep thinking. But his body was betraying him, exhaustion creeping in like a shadow. His eyelids grew heavy, and for a moment he considered closing them. Just for a second. Then the growl came again, closer this time. James tried to retrace his steps, but every direction looked the same. The towering walls of ice mirrored his own growing fear. The further he walked, the more he felt the crushing weight of isolation. His breath came in short gasps as he shouted, hoping someone, anyone, might hear him. Only silence. No matter where he turned, the snowstorm swallowed his footprints, erasing his past and his future in an instant. James realized the horrifying truth. He was lost. James moved blindly through the storm, his legs trudging through knee-deep snow. His breath grew shallow as he fought against the howling wind. The snowfall grew thicker, and his visibility diminished with every step. Each gust of wind stung his exposed skin, numbing his fingers even through his gloves. He clenched his fists, trying to find some warmth, but the cold was relentless. The storm intensified, turning his surroundings into a blinding white void. He stumbled over hidden obstacles, fell into unseen drifts, and struggled to his feet, each movement draining him of more energy. His heart pounded harder. Every part of his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. If he stopped, he would never get up again. After what felt like hours, James spotted a dark shape in the distance. Was it a cave? A rock formation? He could barely make anything out through the swirling snow. He stumbled towards it, driven by pure survival instinct. As he drew closer, relief washed over his chest. It was a rocky overhang. It wasn't much, but it was something. A barrier between him and the deadly wind. He collapsed beneath it, his body trembling violently. He had no fire, no way to warm himself. He needed to preserve the warmth. James curled up, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He reached for his bag, hoping to find something useful, but a wave of nausea hit him as he realized how little he had. His supplies were meant for a short hike, not survival in a blizzard. Minutes stretched into hours. James fought off exhaustion, knowing that falling asleep in the freezing cold could be fatal. He tried to focus, thought to stay awake, but his thoughts slipped away, becoming jumbled and incoherent. The wind roared in his ears, almost like voices whispering through the storm. Was that what it really was? Or was his mind starting to trick him? His breath grew slower, his body weaker. He thought of Tim, of their last conversation. Regret gnawed at him. Should he have turned back? Should he have stayed with his friend? He clung to the memory, using it as an anchor to reality. He couldn't let go. He had to stay awake. But the exhaustion was overwhelming. Just as his eyes were about to close, a sound pierced through the wind, a low, guttural growl. James's eyes snapped open, his heart slammed against his ribs. He strained his ears, listening. Another growl, closer this time. He was not alone. The storm raged on, but now James had something even more terrifying to fear. James tried to retrace his steps, but every direction looked the same. The towering walls of ice mirrored his own growing fear. The further he walked, the more he felt the crushing weight of isolation. His breath came in short gasps as he shouted, hoping someone, anyone, might hear him. Nothing but silence. No matter where he turned, the snowstorm swallowed his footprints, erasing his past and his future in an instant. James realized the horrifying truth. He was lost. James moved blindly through the storm, his legs trudging through knee-deep snow. His breath grew shallow as he fought against the howling wind. Then he saw it, a rocky overhang. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shield him from the wind. He crawled beneath it, his body trembling violently. "I just need to make it through the night," he whispered, his voice lost in the storm. James reached into his bag, his fingers shaking. He had no food, only 4 books, a first aid kit, and a few extra pieces of clothing. A hollow ache gnawed at his stomach, but the realization of how little he had left was far more terrifying. His stomach growled, a painful reminder that he hadn't eaten in almost 24 hours. "I can melt snow," he thought, scooping up a handful and stuffing it into his mouth. But the cold was relentless. Each swallow sent shivers down his spine, worsening his already fragile state. The temperature continued to drop, and soon his fingers lost feeling. He stuffed his hands inside his jacket, desperately trying to preserve some warmth. The night felt endless, the wind howling like an unseen predator waiting to strike. Sleep was dangerous, he knew that. If he fell asleep, he might never wake up. A sound jolted him awake. A crunch in the snow, followed by another. His heart pounded. Something was out there. He squinted through the darkness, and then he saw them, 2 glowing eyes reflecting in the moonlight. The air grew even colder as he realized what was watching him, a Himalayan black bear. James's breath came in ragged gasps. His mind raced with possible actions. Running was impossible. His legs were barely functioning. Fight? With what? His trembling hands clasped his medical scissors, the only weapon he had. The bear didn't move closer, but it didn't back away either. It just stood there, watching. Minutes passed like hours. James didn't dare move. The bear seemed to be sizing up its prey, waiting for an opening, for weakness. James forced himself to maintain eye contact, to appear as fearless as possible, even though fear coursed through his veins. The bear took a step forward. James's breath caught in his throat. He raised his arms to make himself look bigger. "Go away!" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it held every ounce of defiance he had left. Another step. The air was thick with tension. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned and vanished into the storm. James sat there, frozen, long after the bear was gone. He knew it would be back, and the thought gnawed at him. Sleep was out of the question. His mind, already clouded by exhaustion, began to play tricks on him. Shadows moved where there were none. Whispers curled in the wind. He was alone, and yet he felt watched. The cold seeped deeper into his bones. His fingers burned as he rubbed them together, a cruel paradox of frostbite setting in. He stared at his legs, which had gone numb from hours in the snow. Could he still walk? Could he even stand? James forced himself to stand up. His legs trembled beneath him, but he managed to stay upright. He needed to move. He needed to find shelter that wouldn't leave him open to another bear attack. With heavy steps, he trudged forward, each movement a battle against gravity itself. James knew he wouldn't last much longer without warmth. He needed fire, desperately. He searched his pockets for anything remotely useful. He had no matches, no lighter, but then he remembered the small first aid kit in his bag. Inside, there was a tiny packet of alcohol wipes. Could he use it? His frozen fingers struggled to open it. If he could just find something to light. But there was nothing dry, nothing that could have struck a spark. The futility of it all hit him like a hammer. He was in the Himalayas, alone, freezing, with no way to make a fire. Then, an idea struck him. He took out his last book and ripped out a page. if he could somehow create a spark. But how? He had no metal, no flint. He needed something, anything, to create even the faintest ember. His eyes darted around the rocky overhang, searching for something flammable. The thought of burning his own jacket crossed his mind, but without it, he would succumb to the cold even faster. James's teeth chattered uncontrollably. His mind flickered between logic and panic. The thought of giving up crept in. He couldn't let it win. He couldn't let the mountains conquer him. He had to find a way to survive. James pressed himself against the frozen rock, barely breathing. The bear sniffed the air coming closer. He clutched his medical scissors, his only weapon. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the bear could hear it. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the bear turned and vanished into the snow. But James knew it would be back. For 5 nights, James was haunted by the bear. It circled his makeshift shelter, sniffing, watching. It was waiting for him to weaken, to become easy prey. James had no weapon, no fire to scare it away. All he could do was wait. Each night, James listened to the bear's heavy breathing nearby. It never got too close, but it never left either. He lay awake, clutching his makeshift weapon, ready to strike if the animal decided to approach. But deep down, he knew that a single swipe wouldn't be enough. He was too weak, too cold, too alone. The bear's presence began to eat away at his sanity. He imagined its claws ripping through his sleeping bag, its teeth sinking into his frozen skin. He thought of running, of screaming, but where would he go? The storm raged outside, and even if he escaped the bear, he wouldn't survive the night in the open. James's stomach twisted with hunger, the pain radiating through his body. He hadn't eaten in days. His fingers were too frozen to properly open his bag, his limbs too stiff to function. Desperation set in. He looked at his books. The thought of ripping out the pages, of trying to eat the paper, crossed his mind. But what then? A few mouthfuls of paper wouldn't save him. He needed real food. He thought of the bear, of the fresh meat it could provide. If only he had a way to kill it. If only he had the strength to fight. The thought consumed him. If he could take down the bear, he could live. James needed a plan. He had nothing sharp enough to kill a bear, nothing strong enough to fight it head-on. But he had his mind. He knew he needed to lure it in, to set a trap, to outsmart the predator that stalked him. He searched his bag again. Surely there must be something. His fingers found a small packet from the first aid kit, an alcohol wipe. Could he set something on fire? He ripped open the packet, rubbing the alcohol on the torn pages of his book. But he had no way to create a spark. James gritted his teeth as his mind raced through the possibilities. Then he heard it. Heavy footsteps in the snow. The bear was back. James held his breath. The bear was closer than before. It wasn't just circling, it was closing in. He could hear it sniffing, its breath heavy and slow. It knew James was weak. James clutched his medical scissors tighter. He was ready for a fight, but he knew deep down he wouldn't win. The bear growled, a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down his spine. James had to make a decision. Fight and likely die, or flee and face the storm. His pulse throbbed in his ears. He had only seconds to decide. Then suddenly the bear stopped. It sniffed the air one more time, let out a huff, and turned away. James didn't move. He didn't dare breathe until the heavy footsteps had faded completely. It was gone. This time. But for how long? The adrenaline slowly faded. replaced by sheer exhaustion. James had survived another night, but he knew it couldn't last forever. He needed to find food, warmth, and a way to defend himself. He couldn't just wait for death to come to him. For the first time in days, he forced himself to stand. His legs wobbled beneath him. His body screamed in protest, but he refused to give up. He had made it this far. He wasn't done fighting yet. James looked out at the frozen wasteland before him. He had no idea where to go, no idea how far he was from help. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't die here. Not like this. The bear would be back, but when it returned, James would be ready. Each day, James tried to walk, to find a way back. But every direction led to a dead end. Cliffs too steep to climb, ravines too deep to cross. The snow was so thick, he could barely move. He made less than a mile a day. The reality set in. He was trapped. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, a white labyrinth, and every peak looked just like the last. He began to mark the trees and rocks he passed with scratches from his knife, only to realize hours later that he had been walking in circles. Panic seized his chest. He was moving, but he was getting nowhere. By day 10, James had stopped thinking logically. The hunger was overwhelming. He started talking to himself, arguing with himself. He spoke to Tim, to his family, to people who weren't there. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he cried uncontrollably, unable to distinguish the boundaries between reality and hallucination. The shadows in the snow began to take on human forms. At night, he saw figures crouching in the distance just out of reach. Were they rescuers, or ghosts of travelers who had perished here before him? His mind twisted every sound, every gust of wind into a whisper calling his name. James noticed that his feet couldn't feel anything. He pulled off his boots and gasped. His toes were blue. The skin was peeling, the flesh underneath blackened with frostbite. A wave of nausea washed over him as he realized how close he was to losing his limbs. In desperation, he grabbed a pair of dissecting scissors from his medical kit and stabbed them into his foot. No pain. He did it again. Still nothing. That's when the horror hit him. His feet were dying. He had read about frostbite, about how the body sacrifices extremities to keep the core warm. But he had never thought he would witness it firsthand. James knew what would happen next. If he didn't find warmth soon, the frostbite would spread. His toes would blacken further, then his feet, his legs. He would become immobile, unable to walk, unable to escape. His heart pounded at the thought. He had to make a decision. Cut off the dying flesh or let it consume him. He reached for his first aid kit again. His hands trembled as he took out his scalpel. The thought of cutting into his own body made him want to scream. But if he didn't act now, it would be too late. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed the blade against his skin. Pain shot through his body, jolting his senses back to reality. He was still alive. But for how much longer? By day 20, James was too weak to stand. His body had consumed itself, his muscles all but gone. He had no food left, no hope. Then something incredible happened. A rescue helicopter. James jumped up, waving his arms and screaming with the last of his strength. He grabbed a torn piece of his jacket, trying to form a flag. His hands shook, the frostbite making every movement agony. The sound of the helicopter's blades slicing through the icy air gave him the first real hope in weeks. It lifted. For a moment, hope surged in his chest. Then, it flew away. James dragged himself against a jagged rock face, his body screaming in agony. His frost-bitten fingers, stiff as wood, barely functioned, yet he gritted his teeth and forced himself upward, one pull, then another. The pain was excruciating, but he kept going. For 2 agonizing hours, he climbed. His frozen feet were dead weight, forcing him to rely entirely on his upper body. Then, he saw it. A trail. James, half crawling, half stumbling, forward, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then, in the distance, movement. Shadows moving against the white landscape. Villagers. A surge of adrenaline overwhelmed his weakening limbs, and with the last of his energy, he stumbled forward, reaching out to them with the desperation of a man clinging to the edge of life. James's vision blurred. He tried to shout, but his throat was too dry. Instead, he stumbled forward, falling to his knees. The villagers turned. They ran towards him, and then everything went black.